The coronavirus, or its official name, the SARS-CoV-2, is here. The disease it causes is COVID-19. Thankfully, the fatalities in the United States appear to be lower than the worst-case scenario that I talked about in a prior video. But the growth of the infections is still extremely high, and the percentage of infected people that need to be hospitalized is through the roof. What makes this virus so different from the common cold or the seasonal flu? Why is it so worrisome, even though it's not as deadly as SARS or MERS or Ebola? You'll be surprised at the genius of this virus. It's a Frankenstein mutant hybrid that is made up of a clever combination of the worst properties of other viruses. It's an evil genius, really, and is an example of natural selection at its best, or worst, depending on your point of view. And all this havoc comes from something many scientists don't even consider to be a living thing. They are so tiny that 100 million of them would fit on the head of a pin. What makes this super tiny beast so good at what it does? And what can we do to stop it? That's coming up right now. Viruses are very small. They can't even be seen with ordinary microscopes, but only through powerful electron microscopes. Each coronavirus particle consists of a small set of genes enclosed by a coating of protein and a sphere of fatty lipid molecules. They're not considered living things by some because they don't have independent mobility nor any mechanism to metabolize or reproduce on their own. They're completely dependent on the cells they invade to reproduce. However, since viruses contain genes in the form of DNA, or in the case of the coronavirus, RNA, ribonucleic acid, they evolve and become more invasive and deadlier through mutations and natural selection. RNA is less stable than DNA, so they tend to change and evolve faster than DNA viruses. And these things can invade any living cell, bacteria, plants, and animals. The main evolutionary goal of a virus is to invade as many cells as possible and make as many copies of itself as possible. The structure of the virus provides some clues about its success. It's essentially a spiky ball. Those spikes recognize and stick to a protein called angiotensin converting enzyme 2, or ACE2, which is found on the surface of some of our cells, such as in the lungs and in the kidneys. These spikes on the virus are like a key to a door that allows them to enter inside the cell, which is the first step in the infection process. Researchers have found that the shape of the SARS-CoV-2 spikes allow it to stick more strongly to the ACE2 than its cousin, the classic SARS of the early 2000s virus did. And it's likely that this helps it be more infectious because fewer viruses may be needed to easily transmit from one person to another. Typically, tens of thousands of viruses are needed to infect a person, but in this case, fewer may be needed because they're more effective in getting inside our cells. ACE2 is produced in greater quantities in people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So this could be a reason that people with these pre-existing conditions are more susceptible to severe COVID-19 disease. Once a virus sticks to a cell, a process is started that allows the genetic material inside the virus, its RNA, to enter the cell. Once the RNA enters the cell, it tricks the cell into thinking that the RNA is its own and hijacks the cell's protein synthesis center in ribosomes. The cell then reads this foreign RNA and starts making copies of the virus. When most RNA viruses replicate themselves in a host, it leads to frequent mutations because there's no spell check mechanism. Most of these mutations are bad and kill the virus immediately. The SARS-CoV-2 virus, however, has a spell check mechanism, so it can correct errors during the replication process. In other words, they carry special enzymes that corrects mistakes, so that makes this virus even more tenacious and very difficult for our bodies to kill. Once copies of the virus are made, they collect in bubbles called vesicles within the cytoplasm of the cell and are carried to the surface where they disperse to invade even more cells. Once inside a cell, a virus can make 10,000 copies of itself in a matter of hours, and millions of copies are made in each cell before the cell eventually gives up and dies. This onslaught of viruses triggers an immune response from your body. So a bunch of your defensive chemicals are released and the body's temperature rises to fight off this infection. But this reaction swells your tissues and causes fluid buildup in your lungs, making it harder for you to breathe. So often your body's own response is more deadly than the virus itself. Another insidious feature of this virus is that most respiratory viruses tend to infect either the upper respiratory tract, that is the nose, mouth, and throat, like the common cold, which makes it highly contagious but relatively mild, or they infect the lower respiratory tract, like your bronchial tubes and lungs, like the classic SARS and MERS did, where they are less contagious but much more deadly. But this bugger, the SARS-CoV-2, infects both the upper and lower respiratory tracts. It initially invades the upper respiratory systems, your nose, mouth, and throat, but moves progressively to the lungs. This allows it not only to be more severe like MERS, but also highly contagious like the common cold. It could also explain why it transmits so easily, because it starts off as an upper respiratory infection when people may feel very little to no symptoms. And it's during this time that they could be unwittingly spreading the virus. It's only later, 5 to 14 days later, that the virus progresses to the lower respiratory tract, where people really start experiencing more severe symptoms, like difficulty breathing. Another reason for its higher rates of spread versus SARS Classic and MERS is that when people came down with the latter two diseases, they were more quickly debilitated, so they could not spread the disease. SARS-CoV-2, on the other hand, is so mild initially that people are out and about, some not even knowing that they may have a severe viral infection. Highly lethal viruses like MERS and Ebola tend to flame out because they leave no one alive to continue spreading them. SARS-CoV-2, on the other hand, is like a twisted serial killer. It wants to kill, but not too quickly, because keeping you alive allows it to spread more widely. You might ask, why do coronaviruses attack the upper respiratory system and not something else? This is because ACE2 receptors are exposed to the outside. If you think about it, very few of your internal organs are exposed to the outside world, to the air. Your nose, throat, and lungs are a few that are. So that's where the virus most easily attaches itself. Let's be clear. SARS-CoV-2 is not the flu. It causes a disease with different symptoms, spreads and kills more readily, and belongs to a different family of viruses. You can see the comparison of the fatality rates between the two on this chart. Overall fatality rate is 2.8% versus 0.13% for the flu. So SARS-CoV-2 is more than 20 times deadlier. Now you might say, well, there's a large percentage of people that don't show any symptoms. Data shows that that's about 30%. But even if you believe that up to 50% of people show no symptoms, this would still be 10 times more deadly than the flu. In addition, based on experiments so far, researchers estimate that COVID-19 is about twice as contagious as the common flu. One person on average affects about 3 people, whereas someone with the flu infects about 1.6 people. This is not as bad as some of the most contagious diseases, such as measles, in which a person infects on average around 12 other people. In addition, the hospitalization rates for people with COVID-19 is sky high. Reports from New York and China are that 20% of people with symptoms need hospitalization. This compares to about 1.4% for flu victims, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the US CDC. So let's put aside this dangerous idea that SARS-CoV-2 is just like the flu. It is not. The closest wild relative of SARS-CoV-2 is found in bats, which suggests it originated in a bat and then jumped to humans either directly or through another species like the pangolin, but no one knows for sure. Typically, when viruses cross over from its animal carrier to humans, it usually requires multiple genetic mutations for this to happen. Research suggests, however, that SARS-CoV-2 appears to not have mutated, but directly crossed over to humans. And its genes are very stable, not mutating much. This is probably because it is already highly effective in its function, which is to spread and replicate as much as possible. So there's no evolutionary pressure on the virus for it to change or mutate. Now I can just read your comments right now about potential conspiracies here, because what I've told you so far makes it seem like the perfect virus. You may think that there must have been an intelligence behind it. In other words, perhaps it was engineered in a lab. Because you could easily think, what are the odds that a random bad virus had exactly the right combination of traits to be the perfect virus to bring down human civilization? Now, I admit that the odds are not high, but you have to remember that there are trillions upon trillions of viruses out there undergoing billions upon billions of mutations all the time. And in those terms, odds are pretty high that in the course of human history, a virus such as this is going to emerge. And you should also know that the virus has been analyzed extensively by multiple teams of scientists to see if anything about its genome is engineered, and all have come to the conclusion that it is not engineered. It is a naturally occurring virus. So now you know how perfect a virus this is. What can you do about it? How do you protect yourself? Right now there's no cure. There's no vaccine, and antibiotics will not work because antibiotics can't kill something that is not really alive. But the good news is that the virus is very fragile outside the body. It is only protected by a thin layer of fat. This is why soap and water is the best method to kill it. Soaps and detergents cut the fat. In fact, anything that destroys fats is good for killing the virus. The other things that kill it are 65% or higher alcohol. By the way, alcohols that you drink, like whiskey or vodka, unless it's a particular brand of Polish vodka, only have about 40% alcohol. So don't go spraying your hands with vodka thinking it's going to kill the virus. And drinking any alcohol will not protect you under any circumstances. Chlorine will also kill the virus, but vinegar will not. Heat melts fats too, so cook your food as much as possible before eating. And if you eat any raw foods, wash it with soap and water before you do. Lipid shells are also vulnerable to elements. A study showed that the SARS-CoV-2 survives for no more than a day on cardboard and 3 days on metals and plastics and other surfaces. But this also means that if you touch any surface that you're not familiar with, wash your hands as soon as possible with soap and water. Also be careful dusting surfaces because the dusting could release the virus in the air, allowing it to get into your nose and mouth. Don't touch your face at all unless it's after you've washed your hands. Now, what about wearing masks? Well, the only masks that's going to be effective are ones that filter out viruses, like the N95 mask. If you have an N95 mask, then go ahead and wear it. Don't go out and buy a mask because then you might be taking a mask away from a healthcare worker. And we need them to stay as healthy as possible to save us when we get sick. But if you have a mask already, I don't see how it could not give you at least some protection. Now you have to be careful not to touch it because any virus in the air will cling to it. This advice is completely my opinion and not backed by any science, but I want to show you this chart. I can't help but ask whether the social acceptance of wearing masks in public in these Asian countries has something to do with their lower infection rates. But one of the best things we can do as a society is to allow the healthcare system to catch up in treating the number of people hospitalized and not get overwhelmed. If your circumstances allow it, stay home. Don't interact with other people unless you have to. Stay at least 6 feet away from others because the virus can survive in the air for up to 3 hours and can be transmitted to you during the time that you're around other people. The good news is that this too shall pass. We will develop a vaccine, and over time, little by little, the virus will likely mutate and change, until one day, it may just be like another virus like the cold or flu. And in the future, every time we have a stuffy nose or sore throat, we will remember that time in 2020 when the world came to a screeching halt because of this tiny evil genius that is the coronavirus. Take care of yourself, my friend, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.